Risk of Rain 2 is the best roguelike ever made.
Power! Power!
Or at least it was. But that was before Gearbox bought it. And the first piece of content Gearbox has made with their brand new and shiny IP has completely destroyed the game as we know it. The final boss can become immune to damage. Ultra rare elite aspect drops can dupe items and also delete items from your inventory. Insane visual bugs, insane audio bugs, and plugging in a second controller to your game can delete your entire save file, sending hundreds or even thousands of hours down the drain. This is what Risk of Rain 2's newest DLC, Seekers of the Storm, has brought to the game. Bugs upon bugs upon bugs, making the game a misery to play. So let's talk about the horrendous state that Risk of Rain 2 is currently in. When you first start up a run of the new DLC, things might not seem too different, but it won't take long for bugs to start creeping into the game. The first thing I noticed personally is item spawns being broken. Any object that you can buy items from can spawn right next to cliffs, so that if you buy the item falls off the map. Although this bug is relatively minor, you can just avoid these items, right? But what about this one? Acrid has a leap ability that he's supposed to be able to use to slam into enemies. But now, if you slam an enemy with this leap, you sort of just slide right off. There's also a bunch of other dumb bugs, like Artificer's Ice Spear pushing enemies around. There's also this item, called the Warped Echo. It's a new item that has a very simple effect. While the item is active, the next time you take damage, instead of taking it all up front, you take half of it now, and half of it 3 seconds later. But this item is bugged in two different ways. The first bug is that sometimes, instead of taking half up front and half later, instead you take full damage up front, and then full damage again 3 seconds later. The second bug is even dumber than that though. If you go to Mithrix and he steals your items, and you give him a Warped Echo, plus any other item that can stack, like this new item for example, then Mithrix will become completely immune to damage. He's just invincible and the game soft locks. This same bug also happens if you play as the Heretic. If the Heretic acquires these two items together, they become immortal. And the worst bug of all is the Couch Co-op bug. Couch Co-op was announced as a selling point for the new update. It was a part of their marketing campaign. But if you go to your game and you plugged in a second controller whilst Risk of Rain 2 was open with the intention of playing the Couch Co-op, your save file would instantaneously get deleted. And nobody knows why it happens. Good job, Gearbox. Just fantastic. Round of applause. This is easily the worst bug Gearbox shipped in this update, literally deleting thousands of hours of people's progress. But there's one more bug I want to talk about, because it's a bug that's so obvious, so easy to notice, and so widespread that it is unbelievable that not a single developer caught this and fixed it before shipping the DLC. So let's say you download Seekers of the Storm and you want to play Loader. You start a new run and you instantly notice that Loader's movement feels incredibly strange. Loader's grapple hook makes you move insanely fast. This is stage 1 with no items. And here is a comparison to what that looked like before the update came out. At first, I thought this was just supposed to be a loader buff, but as it turns out, that's not the case. Instead, Gearbox made Loader's grappling speed change based on your frame rate. Yeah, this is what Loader's grapple hook looks like if I cap my game at 30 FPS. It's a night and day difference from this clip where my frame rate's uncapped. This might not sound like a major bug to you, but this is not the only thing that is now tied to frame rate after the update. In fact, most interactions in the entire game are frame rate dependent now. Higher FPS makes the enemy director spawn enemies more frequently. I've also heard a lot of people claim that the difficulty scaling is affected by FPS, but in my testing I couldn't actually verify this, so maybe take that one with a pinch of salt. The physics is tied to FPS in a bunch of different ways. Loader's grappling hook is just one example of that, but there's many more examples out there. Enemies that shoot lasers will do more damage at higher FPS because the laser ticks faster. Items will sometimes proc faster and slower based on your frame rate. This new item, Warped Echo, will take longer to do the second instance of damage to you on lower FPS. And it's likely that there are many more items that are also affected by frame rate in a similar way. And this is just the stuff that we know about within the first week or so of the update. Who knows how many other things are tied to your frame rate? And the funny part is, calling this a bug is a bit of a misnomer. You don't just tie all of these in-game mechanics to frame rate by accident. You'll often hear it referred to as delta time dependency. Delta time is just computer nerd speak for how much time it takes for your game to go from one frame to the next. So delta time dependency is having the logic in your game dependent on delta time. And having delta time dependency in your game is no accident. It's an intentional decision made by the developers. So calling all of these things bugs might seem appropriate because they sure do feel like bugs, but in reality, it's all by design. This is on purpose, and I have a pretty sound theory as to why they decided to do this. See, before Gearbox bought the entire IP of Risk of Rain, they were still a publisher for the game, and part of Gearbox's job was to work on the console version of Risk of Rain 2. The console version was completely garbage under their watch. It was obscenely buggy, and there were extraordinarily long gaps between DLCs releasing on PC and then releasing on console. But when Gearbox acquired Risk of Rain, they wanted to unify the codebase of the PC and console versions. So Gearbox took their completely garbage console code and they ported it to PC. And then they started working on Seekers of the Storm using this old console code. Having your frame rate tied to logic in a PC game is a terrible idea, because people's frame rates can go as high as their system will allow. But on console, having frame rate dependent logic isn't nearly as detrimental. It's still not a good idea to do this, but it's not catastrophic. And the small amount of playtesting Gearbox did for the DLC was probably done entirely on console, because this is the system that their developers are used to playtesting. And they assumed that this would be fine because the console and PC code were identical. But when the update shipped, the PC version had a whole bunch of glaring issues that they never noticed while playing the game capped at 60. Although honestly, this is probably pretty generous thinking, because with the state that the game released in, I would be shocked if they playtested the game for more than 30 minutes. This also explains why there's so many other bugs too. The console version of the game has always been a buggy mess, and they just ported all of those bugs over to PC without fixing them. So if you are a long-standing Risk of Rain 2 fan and you go to play the new update, you won't be able to play for more than 3 minutes without noticing dozens of different bugs, all of which vary from minor annoyances to completely game-breaking. But I wanted to play devil's advocate a little bit. I want to give Gearbox the benefit of the doubt, at least a little bit, because there is another potential explanation as to why this update is just so garbage. You see, Gearbox bought the Risk of Rain IP in 2022, but on June 12th, 2024, Gearbox themselves were bought by Take-Two Interactive, the giant conglomerate responsible for GTA 5, Red Dead Redemption, and the 2K sports games. So if we're being generous to Gearbox here, it's possible that Gearbox and its developers knew full well that the DLC wasn't in a good enough state to be released. It's possible that they wanted to spend more time fixing the update, but they weren't able to because Take-Two Interactive wanted them to ship the product as soon as they could. Take-Two just spent $460 million on Gearbox, and they want to start making some of that money back. So they force Gearbox to send the DLC out of the door, despite the fact that it's clearly not finished, because they want the Gearbox acquisition to look worth it on their next quarterly report. Whether this is actually what happened, we will likely never know, but it seems like a pretty good explanation, because this new update is so insanely broken that it's hard to believe that all of this would slip under the radar. Even with minimal playtesting, how do you not catch some of this stuff? But even if this is all completely true, and that Gearbox was forced to rush out the update, that still doesn't change the fact that I don't think Gearbox really understands what makes Risk of Rain 2 a good game. Because you might have noticed, I haven't even talked about the actual content of the DLC yet. There's so many stupid game-breaking bugs that no one's even talking about the content. Gearbox added 3 new survivors, some new enemies, new stages, and a new final boss. And even if we ignore the bugs and just pretend that they don't exist, the content that they've shipped is incredibly lackluster. And in some instances, the new content actively makes the game way worse. The most egregious example to me is this new elite type. It's called a Twisted Elite. They have this big blue bubble surrounding them. If you shoot the Twisted Elite itself, nothing happens. But if you damage any other enemy inside of that bubble, you take undodgeable damage in in return. In theory, this doesn't sound like the worst idea in the world, right? Forcing players to actually think about whether they should or should not shoot an enemy is an interesting concept. It's the same logic behind why they made the Boomer and the Witch in Left 4 Dead, and those enemies are great additions. On paper, it seems interesting, but in practice, it ends up looking something like this. Risk of Rain 2 is a game where you can't really control what you do or do not deal damage to most of the time. Unlike in a game like Left 4 Dead, where you have a high precision rifle where you can just not shoot the Boomer, most of the strongest builds in Risk of Rain 2 rely on proc chains, where you have a bunch of different items that all have percent chances to proc, and they all chain into each other to deal massive damage. If you proc an item on any enemy in the entire stage, there's a relatively high chance that you will accidentally do damage to something inside of this bubble. You don't have any control over this. It's not something you can intentionally avoid. So there's just a percent chance that dealing damage to an enemy anywhere on the map gets you killed instantly. It'd be like if Vampire Survivors added an enemy that deals damage to you whenever you deal damage to it. It just doesn't make sense for the type of game you're playing. And this elite type literally makes the game unplayable if your run goes on for long enough. You just can't do damage to any enemy because you might accidentally explode. Now, this elite type is by far the worst offender of anything they added to the game, but most of the other stuff in the update is also an incredible disappointment. Like, there's also these things called Halcyon Shrines. You charge them up by standing in this bubble that steals gold from you. Not a bad idea in theory, but in practice, this takes way too long to fully charge. It's insanely time consuming, even later in the game where you have 1,000,000 gold. There's also the new final boss, and he kind of feels unfinished to me. Like, his sound effects kind of suck, and he feels completely weightless, and he doesn't telegraph what he's doing very well. Whereas Mithrix feels fast and dangerous, the False Sun just feels like a really tanky regular enemy. Most of the regular stage bosses feel like they have more weight to them than this guy does. I've heard many mixed opinions on the new survivors, but personally, the only one I like is Seeker. The other two just feel boring to me. The only two things I like about this update is the art and the music. The stages look really cool, and the new characters look great too, even if they don't necessarily play great. And the music is phenomenal, but that shouldn't be any surprise to anyone by now. Chris Don't Miss. We've known that Chris Don't Miss for a long time now. But everything else just feels like a massive disappointment, even if we pretend that the game isn't completely infested with game-breaking bugs. And this entire situation has just got me feeling depressed. Risk of Rain 2 is one of my favourite games of all time. It's such a masterpiece. And when Gearbox bought the IP for Risk of Rain, everyone was freaking out about how Gearbox is a terrible company. And I just brushed all that off. I had faith that this would all be fine. And I was completely wrong. And now, one of my favourite games is in a state where I literally don't want to play it ever again. And if you've never played Risk of Rain 2, don't buy it. Don't buy it in the state it's in, and especially don't buy Seekers of the Storm. Do not give Gearbox a single penny. Not until they fix the mess they've made. But at least the silver lining in all of this is that my man Chris released some absolute bangers for this DLC. Take it away, Chris.